to be leaders of tomorrow's church. When I got to the tent at the other end of camp, there were between 600 and 700 waiting for me. And they weren't over-enthusiastic teenagers. 85% were young men in their 20s already into a career. Now, if God in 1 week can call 600 to 700 young men to get ready to lead tomorrow's church, I tell you the tide is turning. Our problem now is how to train them. We're reluctant to send them to a theological cemetery. And we're having to dash around the country. My wife and I are now tramps. We have no church. We just are in a car. We travel 25 or 30,000 miles a year around England in the car. And we've been to 200 cities and towns in the last 2.5 years. And I tell you, everywhere we go, there's new life. There are new churches springing up all over the place. Television had a comment on this. They produced an hour's program, and they went to a little church in London, not so little actually, and they said, what is happening when a taxi driver starts the church? That's never happened before. Did you see that program, Lionel? And the taxi driver with his church, wasn't it exciting? What's happening when a taxi driver starts a church? And it's the best church in the London borough. What's happening? Well, the tide's a long way out, but it's coming in. It's turned. Samson's hair is growing again. And I sense a 2 to 3 year gap between where we are in England and where you are. I sense all the basic questions that have come up with us are coming up with you now. And one of the reasons I believe he sent me here is to share some of the things we've learned in the last 2 to 3 years that are very exciting. Now then, I must close, and there are just 2 more things I want to say to you tonight from the story of Samson, just 2. And the first is this. Samson, to do what God wanted him to do at the end of his life, had to ask a little boy to take his hand and lead him. And when I first shared this burden that I'm sharing with you tonight, it was with 3,000 or 4,000 young people. And when I got to this point, I looked out and I saw the boy. It wasn't one boy, it was all those young people. And I realized those young people would take the church by the hand and show them where to push. And I shared it with them and said, you are to be the boy. Don't kick Samson, don't laugh at him, just take the hand and show him where to go. Show him where the action is. And I'll never forget that night. Not as long as I live. There were young people who fell on the floor, weeping for the church. And ripples of that night went out all over England. And one girl was there who was the only young person in her church. Can you imagine that? How lonely she was. No young people's fellowship. Not even half a dozen. She was the only young person in the church. And she went back to her church, which was in Wales. And she wrestled with what I'd said. And she kept saying, I'm the boy. And she wrestled with this. And finally, after 3 months agony, she wrote a poem, which I believe to be a prophetic poem. I've got it with me. And I can't read this without being moved to my depths. God is restoring poetry to the church. Most biblical prophecy came in poems, you know. Listen, it's called The Boy Who Held His Hand, and it reads like this. They gouged them out. At first I could not bear to look, empty and raw and cruel. I would not look, the shock of emptiness, knowing that he would not see. I watched the shaven head bowed low, rocking with the rhythm of the grindstone, round, round, round. I watched the needless shackles, heavy and hard, biting the flesh that needs no binding. Now, it does not matter that his eyes are gone. I am his eyes. He sees through me. He has to see through me. There is no other way. And I have wept the tears he cannot weep for all those careless years. And I have learned to love this broken man, while he has learned at last to fear his God. So, I am not afraid to die, happy to be his eyes this one last time, taking his hand, leading with practiced care, step by guided step, into the place where he can pray, Lord, O sovereign Lord, and as the pillars fall, I cry, Amen. Isn't that a poem? Boy, she got the message. You young people, I charge you with the solemn responsibility of leading the church in this land and showing the church where to push. Now, you young people, you can switch off for 3 minutes. I'm going to speak to those over 35. And to those of you over 35, I want to plead with you to swallow your arrogance that tells the young people how to do it, that thinks it knows better. Because under our leadership, the church has not grown, nor has it occupied the land. So on what grounds dare we say we must encourage the young people, but actually we must bring them under our control? We, after all, are the elders, and we know best. I just want to say God is reversing that thing. It may be part of Maori culture to look to the elders. It may be part of Pakeha culture. But God has chosen a different way. It is consistent with what he did years ago. When Jesus wanted to start the church and beat the religious traditions of his day, he chose 12 young men barely out of their teens. And Timothy was such a young man, and Paul said, "Don't let anyone despise you, youth." I was in a Brethren assembly in Bristol recently. It was the one started by George Muller. Have you heard of George Muller? Yes. And I smelled death in that assembly. You know, you can smell death or life in a church. You can smell whether it's spring or autumn just by going in. And I asked for the average age of the eldership, and it was high. And I said to them, "Did you know that this assembly used to double its numbers every year? It grew 100% a year when it began." And I said, "I'll tell you the secret. The oldest elder was 25 years of age, and that was George Muller. And all the other elders were younger than he was." That was a shocking thing to tell them, wasn't it? But it was the truth. They are not doubling their numbers every year now. And we're going to need to humble ourselves. That's why I spend time with Youth for Christ. I learn more from them than I teach them. A Baptist minister came to me last year at a minister's conference, and he said, "David, can you help me?" He said, "My ministry." He said, I'm churning out 2 sermons a Sunday, and I have nothing from God to say. That's the treadmill, by the way. And he said, "I'm dry inside. I'm empty. My home," he said, "is the unhappiest home in the valley where I live. My wife has injured her back, and she's a permanent invalid. I have to do everything for her on top of my job. My children are in rebellion. They won't come near church. My home is so unhappy." He said, "I've nothing." And he said, "I've got to go on in the ministry." But he said, "I can't face another 20 years of this. Can you help me?" And your heart bleeds when you meet a minister who's honest enough to tell you where he is. I just had 5 minutes with him, and I said, "Lord, you'll have to give me a word of knowledge or a word of wisdom quickly for this man, because I haven't time." And the Lord puts very clearly in my mind the total answer to his problem. It was such a shock, such a surprise. I wondered how he'd take it. I said, "Look, I've got the full answer to your problem. The Lord has told me what you're to do." But I said, "It'll be hard to do, and I must ask you a question first to check up on something, because if what he's told me is right, then somewhere near you in your valley, there is some spiritual life, is there?" And he thought for a minute, and he said, "Well, yes." He said, "There's a new church started up the valley. It's only 30 young people, and they're led by 3 young men in their 20s. He said that there's certainly life there. I don't know how sound they are or how balanced they are, but there's life there." I said, "Right. Here's the answer. You are to go to those 3 young men, tell them what you've told me, and ask them to lay hands on you and pray for you." And his face immediately registered how hard that would be. I'm sure he'd much rather I'd have prayed with him, because we were the same age. But I said, "That's the answer God has told me." And I said, "I won't ask you if you've done it, because I know it's tough. But that's the prescription." And he left me, and I've never seen him again from that day to this. But 6 months later, I went to a conference of 120 young men, all in full-time Christian service, building churches all over England. And a young man came up to me and said, "Did you send a Baptist minister to us a few months ago?" I said, "Yes, he came. What happened?" And they said, "Well, we've never been so humbled in our lives. We were broken by the fact that he would come to us for help." I said, "No, I want to know what happened to him, not you. What happened to him?" And they said, "Well, we went to his house and we laid hands on his wife, and she was completely healed. And then we talked to his children, And we brought them to the Lord. And that home is now a happy family. And they said, furthermore, I said, but what happened to him? And they said, he's now our elder